a two-handed presentation. We've got a duo of presenters for us. First of all, I'm looking at you, Gaspard Jaboulay. You're a Director of Qualitative Studies for the Business Strategy and Opinion Department at IFOP. And Krystel, Lepresle, you're the Delegate General for Wine and Society. And the purpose, the subject of your presentation is to give us a bit of an overview of emerging trends in the use, if you will, broadly speaking, consumption of wine, consumer habits, consumer expectations, the broader culture around wine, and then after some suggestions, some ideas for the industry, which I'm sure are going to trace out some potential avenues for future development. And if you have any spot you and come out and answer and ask our questions, which our speakers will be happy to answer. Over to you. Hello, everybody. Yes, well, as Claudia has just explained, they've asked us to speak as a pair, which I think is absolutely fun because we've got a study which was commissioned by Wine and Society, Société, and was conducted by IFOP, so we're happy to present it to you together. I'd like to begin by thanking the organisers for inviting us to take part in this debate, which really is of fundamental importance for the future of the wine industry, the wine sector, and for France in general, because the relationship between French people and wine is a very distinct and distinctive relationship. Gaspard, perhaps you'd like to say a few words about the about the methodological. Yes, I can tell you about the where these results are coming from. We have a quantitative study which we conduct, which allows us to observe the long-term trends, the long-term evolution of trends in consumer attitudes towards wine, consumption of wine, and attitudes. We also have a number of we also have a qualitative study. A qualitative study is more of a methodological Zoom. We focus in, we speak with the consumers for an hour and a half, a long-term form conversation. Have a better really drill down deeper into their relationship with wines. And we conducted studies on wine and men, wine and women, and wine with Gen Z. So that gives us a lot of data to analyze. And it's worth insisting on the fact that our qualitative studies often tend to come out with the results which are a little bit more exaggerated than they might be. And that's the idea with these results. It's about being very clear about the things that aren't working and to propose some solutions which sometimes may seem a little bit radical. And I'll also take the opportunity, Krystel, to thank the Cité du Vin for the invitation. And I will apologize in advance for some of the things in our findings, our studies, which are perhaps some truths which may be difficult to hear. But apologize for anyone's vaguely offended. So in any case, the first question, why does wine need a new narrative, a new story? Gaspard has already hinted this a little bit. Vin Société, Wine Society, my company, for more than 10 years now has been working with the IFOP to maintain a long-term study tracking the relationship of people to wine. You can see there is a strong connection. French people feel very connected as part of their cultural identity. 94% indeed of French people say that wine is part of France's cultural identity. 94% think that winemakers have an exceptional know-how which deserves to be respected and protected. But then if you look and drill down into that data into a bit more detail, and generation by generation, you can see that the difference between people over the age of 65 and those under the age of 25 is very different, and those perceptions are not entirely aligned. So a lot of industries, a lot of sectors will be happy to see this kind of number, even the people down to the age of 25. But what we see, if you look at the red there at the left of each graph, asking for young people under the age of 24 if they think that wine is part of their cultural identity, only 85%. Well, only 85 sounds like quite a lot, doesn't it? It's like a decent result. But if you look at the older generations, 25, 35, 35 to 49, and then 15, 60 and over, the older I think people get, the more they seem to be attached to it. So that does seem to indicate that there's been a bit of a breakdown in the generational transmission of that wine culture, which risks wine becoming a calcified product, which is associated with older generations. And that translates into the barometers for French people's attitudes towards wine, and with really concrete impact on the consumption of wine. Look at the regular consumption of wine in moments of celebration, conviviality, the perception of wine as a drink which is modern, as wine which is a drink which it has evolved of its time. Compared with the opinions that people have of beer, look at it. It's completely opposite trends. 10 years ago, wine was pretty much neck and neck with beer in terms of public image, public perception, or sometimes above. Over the last 10 years, wine has really gradually, slowly but surely, lost ground to beer on a number of fronts. If you look, for example, the fact that wine is something that you consume regularly, there is a 20% gap now between wine and beer. So you can see there is a generally slipping away, and that fact that wine is becoming something that is a heritage icon, something which is old, calcified in its age. There is a bit of a slip towards, and which is already well underway, this process. Wine used to be part of popular culture towards something which we might call high culture as in it's selective, it's elite, it has its own standards and norms that have to be transmitted and learned. This morning, Olivier Jacquet talked about the limited vocabulary around wine 1950s, but these days actually there is, if anything, is a massive vocabulary around wine, and that vocabulary actually creates a bit of a distance with consumers. They feel put off by it, whereas in the past wine was something day to day. It was a day-to-day popular experience. It was part of everyday life. It was on the table at normal mealtimes, and there's something in the family environment, and those cultural codes are gradually being lost as wine slips into another realm. And that, again, that is the trend for what we call patrimonialization of wine being calcified, and that really is anathema to innovation. The figures here are very clear. You can see this patrimonialization in action that creates a sort of rigidity, a resistance to change, not just within the wine industry, but which ultimately is used to innovating. There's a sector which is innovating to adapt to climate change and other challenges too. But with consumers, wine is now is increasingly perceived as a symbol, as a totemic item. And so consumers will often say, innovating with wine or the way that you consume wine would be like a betrayal in some respects. And that transpires really clearly from our fifth edition of our study, which was published last year. We asked French people whether they'd be prepared to drink wine as part of a cocktail or wine out of a can. I'm not going to list all of the figures. You can read them for yourself. But the score is out of 10. You can see that none of these suggestions got more than half marks, got more than 5 out of 10. And if you look at the different proposals, you can see that people under the age of 35 were actually more likely than their older counterparts do. But still, even younger people were resistant to this kind of innovative way of consuming wine, not because it's not in line with their lifestyles, of course it does, but actually because we've created a world where wine is sacralized, it's symbolic, and they would feel like they were doing something wrong, that they were betraying the history and rules of wine. So what we've done over the past 70 years, I mean, we're certainly capable of changing tack and moving things in a different direction for the coming years, and Gaspard's going to talk a bit more about that now. Yes, the situation is very clear. We have a product which we love. Wine has a very positive images, but it's something people that feel they shouldn't touch, they shouldn't be changed, and it doesn't really fit in with our day-to-day lifestyles, which is a bit of a trap, a golden cage. The idea now is that we need to develop a new culture, or new cultures, plural, of wine. When we talk about culture, of course, we're here in the Cité du Vin. What we're thinking of is not high culture. We're talking about the kind of spontaneous, low popular culture which can be spontaneously transmitted by itself without the need of a cultural institution such as the Cité du Vin, for example. No offense, but think of a living, popular wine culture which naturally spreads throughout society. And so, sorry, wrong button. So, to rise to this challenge of how to re-inject some dynamism into the popular culture of wine, we think there are 4 major challenges that need to be tackled. The first is visibility. When do we make wine visible? When should wine appear in people's lives? Second challenge is pertinence. Is wine currently really consistent, commensurate, pertinent for people in their day-to-day lives? Number 3, accessibility, another major challenge. The more that the wine becomes conceived as something as an item of heritage, the harder it is to engage with it. So it needs to be accessible to everyone, the way that wine used to be. And point 4, identity. We need to create new narratives with new figures, new people with whom consumers feel that they can identify. And we do have a problem at the moment of embodying the identity of who is a wine consumer, who is a wine drinker. To go back a little bit to that challenge of visibility, let's talk about what's working and what's not working. Why is wine not present foremost in people's minds at the moment? Well, it all begins at home, in the family environment. And things have changed considerably. There's been a real breakdown in that mechanism of family transmission, of transmission from generation to generation, an active transmission of wine culture, and sometimes passive also, just implicit, the way that wine is present in family occasions. But in the past, parents would talk about wine. Wine was visible. There was a bottle of wine on the table every day, and they would talk about it with their children. That's no longer the case so much, and that culture is not being passed on. And there is more of an interest in prevention now, of course, in risk prevention. And increasingly, there are parents who try not to have their children see them drinking alcohol. And which is, I mean, in some respects, that's good news, certainly, but it does take wine out of the imagery, the images we associate with day-to-day life. There were two extracts from interviews here on the right. The first one is a man of 63 years old. He said, I remember my own father when I was 12 or 13. It was my first communion, and he sold me my first glass of wine. So you have that kind of religious subtext. It's the first time he drunk wine. And then you've got a man who's 25, and he says, wine makes me think of my granddad. It's an old person's thing. And that these days, people do think, I mean, just in family, it's very often granddad in the family who's the one you associate with wine culture. And we also, we do these qualitative. We also do, we also look into, what we call meme culture. We take an interest in meme culture because meme culture really is part of the popular imagination. So this is you take a picture and you put it's the way that young people use, really just capturing a moment. And it's part of the new way in which the sociological truth has spread these days. And the idea of a grandfather, it comes up time and time again. When you find memes or social media representations of wine, the word granddad, grandfather comes up time and time again. And in some respects, that is part of the imaginary world of wine, which is going around on social media these days. So the vertical generational transmission from one generation to the next is breaking down, and things are not going to get better. The generation of the grandfather who get their grandkids tasting wine as kids, that's not going to happen anymore. So we need to think of new modes of transmission. That means horizontal, within age groups, between communities of peers. And that horizontal form of transmission is actually very often more effective than vertical transmission in terms of dietary behavior and habits. Unfortunately, this is the bad news, there are a lot of competitors in the field. I'm not going to list the advantages of beer for you here, but there they are. But more and more young people are drinking less wine, drinking more beer. Beer has a certain number of advantages that they find. It's kind of a lowest common denominator. Most of young people, pretty much everyone can agree, let's drink a beer, everyone do that. The predictability, I find that interesting. When you order a beer, you know what you're getting. There's an economic factor as well, the cost of a beer. But, consumers say to me, if I order a glass of wine, I never know what I'm going to get. Whereas with Krystel, she's conducting a new study, a younger generation, they're really attentive to the taste, the legibility of the taste and the textures of what they're getting. They're really interested in exploring new cuisines and gastronomies from all over the world, but they want to know what they're getting. When they order something, they want to know that it corresponds to their expectations. And with beer, you pretty much know what you're getting. Very concretely speaking, people are, when you go out for a drink outside a cafe sitting in France, people are drinking less wine, more beer. So that means that the visibility of wine is diminished. Wine is disappearing from the public sphere. Another area where wine is losing ground is online, on social media, particularly against the competition such as cocktails, which look good and they look very easy. You know that red wine, that color, the fact that you can't see the light through the red wine, it doesn't look so good on social media, that's a barrier. there's been a real transformation in a paradigm shift even in. I come from the Facebook generation. Everyone used to post what they were up to on Facebook. You start out in real life and then you stick it up on social. I mean, that exists still, but less and less. But there's a real trend now in younger generations. People are adapting their choices, to what they're ordering, what they're doing, to how it's going to look on social media, and particularly the aesthetic code to social media. It's even more important sometimes for the taste, the fact that the products which look best, you see them all over social media. Matcha, they may not actually enjoy the taste that much, but it looks great. The consumers don't like it, but it looks good on the internet. And so, the social media, that's where the battle will also be fought, on social media. And yes, and as Gaspard said, collectively speaking, there are 440,000 hectares under vine. We're more than capable of creating new experiences which will appeal to consumers, consumers who are interested in experiences, and which is closely aligned to their lives, and what they do. Wine is really, under attack from all sides, but the issues of things such as well-being, pleasure, taking care of your body, those are things which consumers are really interested in. Yoga in the Vineyard, for example, these are the kind of activities that are springing up more and more. And I think we could do a lot more, we could be a lot more creative in inventing new activities in winemaking estates, which provide a really excellent place to do it, and also capable of offering lower alcohol wine solutions. Some producers are putting the alcohol content on the label, saying, look, it's a lower degree of alcohol, might be better for. It depends what you weigh and what you drink, but having a slightly less alcohol in your drink is something people are after looking at. There's an interesting experiment conducted in the UK and Ireland recently, cask beer. Remember, it used to be kind of like the way that we think of red wine that old granddads drink. Old ales, real ales, real ale served in those warm barrels. That used to be something you'd really associate with your grandfather and old stuff. But the kegs that are really coming back into fashion, cask ales really having a moment. That flavor profile was considered to be outdated for a long time. It's really coming back. So changing the consumer experiences, bringing to new flavors, textures, aromas is entirely possible. Gaspard touched on this a little bit as well. It's about rediscovering a certain amount of visibility, and that means you need to chime with the new lifestyles of people. We're not talking just about consumption. It's about giving people permission to consume wine differently. Here are some examples of wine being served in a cocktail. You've seen how young consumers, even older consumers, are particularly interested in wine. Consumers don't know what they want in advance by definition. I mean, by definition, it's down to businesses to want to create something that consumers will enjoy. And then you see that in surveys. The people who really have no interest in wine technically, they are really positive. They react very positively when you talk about mixing wine in a cocktail or cutting it. You can see the Chardonnay Mule cocktail. But also, there's so much that goes around the wine. There was the wines and the vines are things that you could make gummy bears with the leftover leaves from wine, for example. You can have there's a real trend on the social media, and being on social media is essential. Not being afraid to dip your toe into it. I mean, some people it doesn't come naturally, certainly, but if it opens up new routes of reaching consumers, then that's all for the best. The big trend that we've observed recently on TikTok was red wine with vanilla ice cream dropped into it. Personally, I haven't tried that, but really there's been stacks of young people trying that and posting it on TikTok. There's also the cosmetics industry, which is a closely related industry. With there's a lot of beauty products made with great byproducts now. There are even actually trainers being made with great byproducts. There are a whole alternative word there, and I think that the social media is the way to get that messages across.
C'est-à-dire du rôle que doit se donner le
second challenge is that of pertinence, to be in phase with contemporary lifestyles. In our studies, our qualitative studies, we ask consumers, when do you imagine you might consume wine? What are the moments when you consume wine? And they all say it's for major events, That brings us back to that heritage aspect, almost with a religious dimension, marriages, things, weddings, things like that. And what's important here is that the wine isn't it's not associated with the festive aspect. It's a problem because it doesn't create many opportunities for drinking wine in people's minds. The other form of consumption which is mentioned by consumers is during meals. But once again, we have to think about what sort of meals. Is it more family meals? Young people say it's a Sunday meal with the parents, with meat, with rich food. And family meals have evolved. We know there are more and more households with a single person, which also raises a question for bottle formats. But the dishes French people eat have changed, and those dishes were a part of that vernacular, spontaneous wine culture, which was passed down spontaneously through the dishes that were prepared and sometimes contained meat. Here we've used blanquette as an example, veal blanquette, but we see that there is a diet model or a desire to eat certain dishes which is declining. This is by generation, and we see that Generation Z appreciates veal blanquette less than the older generation. And it's interesting to look at this curve with ramen and boboon, two Asian dishes which are popular. So we could have taken other cultural influences from other countries, but what's interesting is to see that there are different cultural layers which are modifying consumer preferences. And what's interesting and important to notice is that these preferences are also changing within certain generations. If we look at the generation from 86 to 95, it's not the same preference as 96-2002, who prefer ramen to boboon. But that says things for the future for wine, which means we're going to need to invest and to develop intragenerational cultures. It will no longer be a horizontal culture of wine that speaks to everybody. There will be certain wine subcultures which will be intragenerational. And now an important graph. We also hear about fast food. We don't realize just how quickly fast food has progressed in France. Today, there are more of these outlets than of traditional restaurants in France, which shows the transformation in our relationship with food. And we're eating foods which, once again, are less easily associated with wine. And so, once again, culturally, wine becomes a less evident product in the face of these preferences. So faced with these changes in our plates and dishes, we need to adapt and to let our imagination run free when it comes to pairing with food. We've given some examples here of things from national campaigns in France, such as the one by the General Syndicate of Champagne growers, top right, but we've also put some more disruptive things here. Barefoot in the US has created an association, a pairing of red wine with Oreo biscuits. This may shock some people, but at the same time, it's something which really is an image which can stick in the mind. And if at least here it's clear that this is a possible pairing, and this is a constant demand from young people, which is to have a predictable taste and to have some really simple information about what they're going to find in the bottle. There's also the nomadic aspect, which has evolved considerably. Our offices are at 12 Rue Sainte-Anne near the Opera, and people have food delivered to them in the building with Uber Eats. I think there are probably 250 restaurants just in our street, but they prefer Uber Eats. But if you have a bottle of 75 centilitres, the problem is fitting that with the way we live today. Very few people drink alcoholic drinks at lunchtime now, but we also don't have the right format if everybody is going to be eating their own meal separately. This is something we see in the studies. We can eat with several of us together, but we each have our own food or drink, which means the bottle no longer unites us. And also, so we were talking about the possibilities of new consumption contexts or situations, where perhaps we've allowed other beverages to take the place of wine, but it would be possible to have draft wine service or to try out new formats. Here with Barefoot, once again, they launched these small formats which are extremely easy to use for picnics and with recyclable materials, so that people can have their individual measure of wine for consumption on the move rather than with the 75 centilitre bottle where you need a corkscrew anyway to open it. So there are quite a few opportunities there, and Gaspard has prepared has decided to create by AI this wine-based slush. So these are places where wine can be present, because this is where the narrative of wine can be updated. And so there's then accessibility, so that to simplify consumption. As wine becomes a cultural heritage object, it becomes a bit too impressive for young consumers. That's no surprise. But I think we always underestimate the extent to which this has happened. There are two different things here. It's a heritage and cultural object. Therefore, when we talk about it, it's something which seems much more imposing and impressive. And there's also at the same time less transmission through our family. We have a lesser understanding or grasp of the codes and traditions. Here, once again, we see this in culture. And it's always the same situations described by consumers. It's when we need to choose a wine in a wine merchant or in a restaurant, and it can be a bit embarrassing. And it's a bit sad. At the same time, we do see that there is an embarrassment, a difficulty to try wine, because people aren't sure that they really have a proper grasp of the codes and of the products. Another thing that seems important is that this pressure to understand wine is something that is felt a bit more strongly among men, as it is a more male-oriented product. And so these men who have greater expectations, social expectations in this respect, it can create a stress or micro-stress which is greater in men and which can contaminate or spoil the moment of consumption, because we think that as a man, I'm going to have to give a judgment, which I'm going to have to put into words, and I'm going to have to find complicated words to express what I feel, what I taste. And this is something a lot of young men we interviewed mentioned. On the other hand, the qualitative studies of women and young women showed that the relationship with wine, as it's considered a more masculine product, is a much more simple, straightforward, without worrying about using the right words. And so they're perhaps leading the way on how to return to a healthier, simpler culture of wine, more spontaneous culture of wine. Then there's the symbolic barrier. So as the symbolic, then the organoleptic barrier with the tannins in the wine. Here, the imagery is very, the associations are very negative in our culture, with the idea, in fact, that consumers have the impression that a good wine is a wine which is extremely tannic, and they're not ready for that taste in the families. So there is a generation effect, and probably also an age effect. When you're young, you're not attracted by this sort of texture. So this creates a certain rejection, a gap between what we like and what we think is good. So a lot of consumers prefer to try other drinks, as Krystel said, because there is this idea that the good wine is not necessarily affordable, accessible, and pleasant. Among the different possibilities we studied in the studies, obviously there is symbolic accessibility through all this proliferation of vocabulary and words in the world of wine, which ends up, and for the consumer, we need to take away this tension by taking ownership of a certain number of terms. So there are all sorts of terms we can use to describe wine in a more accessible way, rather than talking specifically about the organoleptics. We need to provide support to people as they develop their knowledge, but there does come a point where they have to take that first step, and they need to have something which is much more simple and accessible. We also have simple information. Often the back labels provide information which can be useful, but which in some cases might be quite abstract. A lot of people talk about history, bearing in mind that history, when we're tasting a bottle of wine, is not really very relevant, but also talk about the quality of the soils. The quality of the soil and predictability of the flavor, I think in 99 or 98% of cases, really don't know what they're talking about. If they talk about a clay limestone flavor, that doesn't really mean anything to people. But is the wine fruity? Is it sweet or sugary? How predictable is the taste? These are important questions. As have apricot flavors. We need to try to provide consumers with clear information and also with guidance on when to drink the product. We talked about renewing the wine and food pairing. We can perhaps mention that wine can be drunk with rice, pasta, peanuts. We need to say that because young consumers are afraid to make mistakes in pairing the wine with food in terms of the codes of the wine world. So in fact, with Gaspard, we thought it would be interesting to show an initiation process to accompany the consumer through the organoleptic process in a more simple way. Here we have an example of a brand which is called Big Box, which mixes wine without saying it's wine, and which has a rather marketing approach to the product, and which ultimately is getting close to the customer, but with the marketing codes that they're familiar with. We talked about social media, and one other possible way is that there are also things with cocktail-based drinks. And there are products which say exactly what taste they're going to have, with flavors that we've seen come up in the different surveys. We'll have, among young people, there'll be a genuine desire for something that tastes very strong. Obviously, there's also well-being, which is becoming important as well. We often talk about health, but good mental health and conviviality are part of that good health. And then also we need to find formats that enable us, that correspond to today's consumption habits, especially for those who have themselves developed, which may make it possible afterwards to get them to try a bottle of wine, because we're not there to say that there should be a single narrative of wine, but we need to construct the stages to enable the consumer to enter the world of wine without necessarily having a complex about what they're doing. And also the diversity of the products we have to propose is essential in this respect. So let's try to build something together. So the fourth challenge is identity. It might seem a bit abstract, it's difficult to explain. I am going to try, however. Is to say that, does the identity of the wine drinker, is the profile of the wine drinker something that's inspirational, or is it someone we want to look like? Do we want to look like a wine drinker? So we discovered in our surveys that wine is very good at creating collective identities and senses, a feeling of belonging to a wine region, for example, or to a nation. And when there was this this cartoon, when there was the ad about the Oreo, there was a big response, people saying it's scandalous, we can't serve wine with Oreo. So it shows the extent to which wine has become a part of our heritage. We don't touch it, we don't drink it, but whatever you do, don't change it, don't innovate, because it's a product, it's a part of our identity. And so to collect, it's good to create collective identities, but much less so for individual identities. You might say we drink wine because we like the taste, but in fact the consumer behavior increasingly is a catalyst of signals as to who we are, how we live, what we want to look like, be like, especially now that there are no major narratives shaping our political or religious narratives to guide us. So we have these affiliations which are being created around this belonging to small groups. It could be in terms of a beverage or something else. So the way we choose a product rather than another is important because it says a lot about us. Here I've put up some examples. And here it's very much like an archipelago. We often talk about this tendency in politics rather than in consumption, but it's extremely important here, especially for products like wine, which have a universal horizontal vocation, or with a universal heritage, which are speaking to what was once a fairly homogeneous society. What do we do when we have a product which seems to suit everybody, but that society divides up into thousands of little bubbles? We have to see what our place is. So here we see that in each cultural bubble there is a narrative, there's a main character, there's a setting, and the drink is relevant in relation to an issue. It might be to have energy in techno evenings, or to be in good health for gym workshops. This is an aspiration for people. They do accept these things. So it's important that the wine should ask itself this question. So how do we work in qualitative studies on these aspirational aspects? And these are projective exercises. We ask the consumer to imagine the profile of a wine consumer, and you can think about what's going to appear. We'll see whether it corresponds. And we look to see whether these are aspirational. Are these people we want to look like? The first profile is the CSP+, with consumption of more expensive, rather good wine. Do we want to look like them? We don't know. So then there's the hedonist, which is slightly more, evokes more notions of friendship, of pleasure, and good food together, which is aspirational. And the problem is that in our studies, we do see that there is a gap between Generation Z and the figure of the hedonist is often associated with excess. I belong to a generation where being a bon vivant or a hedonist is something which is seen quite positively. And we see in the films, for example, this is interesting, this portrait exists less and less, and is less and less negative when it does. So we have a polarization of portrayals of wine and its imagery between the reality with very sophisticated, distinctive corruption to set ourselves aside from the mass, then a larger productivity-based consumption. But what we need to do here is to take this notion of quantity and place it alongside the current trends in health. At IFOP, we do a monthly survey and a ranking of the concerns of French people. This started before the health crisis, and we see that health has been either number one or number two since then. So it really is linked to demographic change. We have a country which is getting older, but we do see that in younger generations, this preoccupation with health is a major factor. Twice as many of the under 25-year-olds do dry January, much less than for those who are 35, and there are a number of different trends that we can see, and trends that bear testimony to a determination to control and master our wine consumption. They shouldn't be associated directly with wine consumption, but there are food regulation rules which will also have a more selective effect on wine consumption in certain targeted situations. It won't just be consuming table wine with a meal as before. If we look at the imagery of distinctive consumption that we see in the cinema, which are not so positive, like Thierry Lhermitte, here it's not so good. Ronez Lemoine this morning already mentioned Ratatouille. I think that's a very good example. The gastronomy critic, the food critic in Ratatouille is a horrendous personality, as long as they don't reconnect with their memories. And regarding the trends, also, this distinctive consumption is associated with mature consumption. Wine is once we've succeeded, it's when we're old, it's when we're an adult, it's when we have a certain cultural, social and economic capital. But we do see there are a lot of trends that show that the age at which we feel adult is being pushed back, is becoming older and older. The average age for the first child is increasing. The age of the first job is increasing, but do we still want? The limit here when we reach adulthood is that the status of adulthood is much less clear than before. We see that this last data, the average age of video game players, we've seen an important increase, and it's the same people here. So there's no longer leisure being attributed to a specific generation. We are going to be able to have the leisure we want throughout our life. So there's nothing automatic anymore when we discover alcohol. And that's important to take this into account. It comes back to what we were saying. There will probably be different wine cultures, which are different from one generation to another. This is what we can expect to see in coming years. And how can we adapt to these new trends, which are very mainstream, especially among the younger generation? And so we can seek a lifestyle that's healthier. Obviously, that's one trend to which a certain number of operators in the field have provided responses. The wine unions promote moderate consumption, but we showed you the campaign for Alsace Wines, who said that if we have 51 Grand Cru, it's not with the aim of drinking them all in the same evening. So we see these campaigns work well with young people, especially on social media. It enables people to laugh at this and to take a bit of a step back on a subject which is important. We also talked about wine yoga. This is a way of perhaps having a place restored in the life of young consumers. It's quite amusing. And then also the alcoholic degree, and it's important to be able to say, as we've seen, that there are new habits, but we have to be able to produce new drinks with lower alcohol content. So either by de-alcoholization or total, and then we'll be able to meet this expectation to have flexibility in our drinking in search of well-being. And so here you have these memes showing some of the associated imagery. So here again you see the culture of the meme is quite harsh on wine. Conventional red wine on the left and natural red wine on the right. And we see that each time the red wine and the wine that here qu'il faut savoir aussi accueillir en termes de récits naturel fait partie des tendances qui adapt, and that this natural wine also fits in well with the narratives of today's generation. And then, as we said, there's a need to renew, to replace faces in the wine sector and on social media. There are few young wine growers who actually display themselves, at least not enough, and the most famous of them is Iter. But when we did the survey, we saw that the figures of the wine world associated here were often people who were dead. And so we thought to ourselves, okay, we have a problem, but in fact we have young people, young French stakeholders who like wine, but have decided to renew it or to open up to diversity more. So we have this series on Netflix showing a young man who wants to become a sommelier, even though there was nothing to suggest that such a course for him in his life. And so this can be a way to enable other people to identify with this sort of situation and potentially to provide explanations. We have finished now. Perhaps if I could just say a quick word to answer the final question. No, but in any case, we've done our best to try to show the different types of culture and to say that there are interesting things at all ages. We have wonderful products plenty of narratives to come, but perhaps it's up to us to embody them better as a sector, as an interprofessional organization, to talk with consumers and renew this image. And perhaps you could stay for a few more minutes with me, because we are going to take a few questions, which I'm sure we will have on this subject. We'll take a quick look at the drawings. Are there any questions or any denials or anything you would like to say? Do we still have the cube there? We have it. So, thank you for this excellent study. It was really very comprehensive, and it updates the image we might have, the way we construct this imagery in the future. I have more a question, which is that in your survey, did you feel any difference between young urban dwellers and young rurals, so people who like to go out among friends for a walk and who might take a bottle in a straightforward format or an adapted one, but who are still going out to visit the vines and who think it can be interesting, not only to see the vines, but also to see the landscapes created by the vines. And is this something which has been measured? Because we don't see that in your report there. Why? It's true that this report is a bit monolithic, which smooths out a lot of the nuances, but it's true that we see a very clear difference between the inhabitants of rural wine-growing areas, who do have much slower consumption because wine is transmitted through the family or it's part of the system. Among urban dwellers, it depends almost more. At Grande Métropole, the image of wine is almost spoiled. So it's difficult to say and to report back really on this. But I think what is important is to say that the pace is being set by the urban areas. The trends tend to come from the urban areas. So it can be interesting to focus on what is coming from those urban areas, because this rural aspect does spoil things, and it takes longer. So in the studies, what came out the most in terms of distinctions when we focused on Generation Z and on men was profiles, fairly standard profiles, which are not necessarily, but for which there is a risk that people might be exposed to the risk of here that we mentioned earlier, but also it creates a division between people who feel that they do have the culture of wine, they received it in their childhood, and those who do not, and who might be tempted to stay away from this world, or it might be something they're indifferent about as long as they can't really understand it. And that also comes from the difference between what we felt and how we live. Véronique Lemoine.
My question is, I was just interested in your statistics, the way we should read those statistics. In one of your very first slides. No, just checking it's not too loud. It's not too loud. In one of your first slides, you talked about the difference between the generations and their interest in wine. You get the impression that we're heading for a national or international catastrophe if you get the young people who fundamentally don't seem to be interested in wine anymore. My question is, do these younger generations, were we interested in wine at a young generation? I'm wondering when I was 18, if you'd asked me questions about wine and the culture of wine, I'm not sure if I'd have been able to give you much of a better answer than today's young people. Yeah, it can be from your parents, your grandparents, whatever. I agree there could be links in the chain missing, but it reminds me of another aspect which came later in your slides. You're talking about video games and the culture of video games. In 2015, they were younger, now they're older. They're the same people, aren't they? There are always new people coming into recruiting, while the older ones stay with it. So I was wondering, this generation that you're saying, they're not interested in wine yet, ultimately, do you not think that they will get round to it? Just naturally, they're going to just take an interest in the kind of that aspiration effect that you have. Just is there not, should we perhaps not lose all hope yet? Well, I mean, I suppose the answer is yes and no. Alternately, yeah, there are indicators which show that, generally speaking, people do get more interested in wine as they get older. But as if we do get older and older, before it's these days, about 15 years ago, 23, it was easier to be sort of you get a job, move out. These days, adolescence is becoming longer and longer. The people are not remain in adolescence a bit longer. The age at which they feel more that adults, they discover wine, interest in wine, is getting later. So there is a kind of a time shift that's happened there. But there's another factor, and we've been running this for 10 years, this study. The consumption of wine, those figures don't lie. When you look at the figures, the people of 25 years and under, compare those figures to 40 years ago, I mean, there's absolutely no contest that the consumption is down. So that's the interest of comparing these descriptive studies, statistical studies, with what French people tell us about the consumption habits. But you can look at the actual numbers. I'm not saying that people won't come in with an interest in wine if we know how to talk about wine, how to communicate wine. But there is, and there's no argument with it, there is a clear decline, a decrease in wine consumption across the board, and particularly in wine being bought in supermarkets. Do you want to answer the question about video games? No, you're right. It's the same people playing video games. That is interesting. The culture of youth culture does have really a knock-on impact into adulthood. And to go back to your first question, it's very difficult statistically to make a distinction between the product and the generational effect. But there is an age effect in play, and I think that there is a bit of the two at play here. I'm sure that that we're talking about the tannins in the wine. Perhaps that's because people who are not used to wine, that have a culture of wine, they're perhaps surprised by the tannic nature of it, and perhaps young people that haven't had that cultural introduction yet. So you're right. There's always more nuance needed when reading these kind of results. But structurally speaking, there is a breakdown in the transmission of wine culture, and naturally there are going to be consequences of that, because the generation that is coming through into adulthood now, they are less prepared to engage with the culture of wine. But they may, of course, come around to it later. But to add to that, we have done previous studies with Krystel, and we know that consumers, that when you come into a new consumer category, your consumption is when you will take it with you, as you move up in age groups, in different groups, because if you become a regular consumer product, you're very likely to continue. So these days, if people start off drinking by drinking beer, then they may well continue drinking beer later, and they may be by themselves. And so it's really important the moment at which enter into become consumers. So you're right, there is a question of culture here, because we have similar challenges in the cultural sector. So the idea of getting people into the cinema, getting people before the age of 12 will go to the cinema for the rest of their lives, and that's true in theatre and elsewhere. Also, there's a question up there. Yes, hello. My name is Sanjay from the Châteauneuf-du-Pape Wine Grower Syndicate. I'm very interested to see your presentation. The first part of the presentation, you talked about a lot of new ways of consuming, new consumer trends. There was a lot of information there, much of it coming from English-speaking world, I'd say from the UK and the US. My question would be, do you think you could create a similar story, a similar narrative in the context of France's restrictive Evan law on advertising? Yeah, that's an interesting. We know full well that we were talking a bit earlier about adapting to young people's consumption habits. It's a discussion that we had. You're right. The Evan law in France does prevent us from doing a lot of things and to presenting alcoholic drinks in a certain way. Anything which looks like advertising is very difficult to do for wine. But nonetheless, when you look at the universe in which we're operating, I think you're capable of drawing upon some of those imaginary aspects, and the way that we build images. The idea that wine is associated with your pissed uncle, that's not something in which the law Evan is responsible for. That's a generational change. Gen Y, for example, their grandparents were the kind of people that used to consume an awful lot, up to 120 liters a year in that average age. So yes, I will say the Evan law has certainly restricted the possibilities of advertising, but there are still options available. You could, for example, there's nothing against young winemaker appearing on social media, being creative and showcasing what they do out in their vineyards. Emile Conos has done it. He's got 1 million subscribers now. I'm not sure that I know not everyone's going to have 1 million subscribers on Instagram, but it's a way of engaging with people. And he says he has a lot of followers who don't know anything about wine. So the cultural dimension of wine can be very useful in communicating and saying, this is what I do at this season. We do this in the vines, this in the. There are so many stories to be told. And so sorry to go back to this example again, but beer continues to gain market share in France. Wine's losing market share. And, the beer is subject to the Evan law just as we are. So I think there's plenty of possibilities to exploit it, and we believe it, and we want to continue trying new things. I've got a question. I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but in any case, thank you very much for the presentation. You mentioned that generational vertical transmission is broken down, the parents in the family sphere educating their children about wine. But you talked about the importance of horizontal transmission, so young people influencing each other. So my question then is, what about public policy? Should our cultural policies try to do something to stop this breakdown and that generational father to son, mother to daughter generational transmission, or conversely, can we do more to encourage the horizontal transmission of wine culture? What can we do to create systems, mechanisms which are conducive to these two different forms of cultural transmission? You have social media, for example, for horizontal. Should we be focusing on getting into young people's bubble, their social media bubble, where they do seem to live in a bubble? Everyone's kind of living in their own world. Should we be trying to burst into that bubble? It's an open question. I don't know if that's going to make the world any better. I guess getting quite philosophical there. Yeah, thanks. I suppose, a bit of both. Why not? We shouldn't be ruling out anything. We know that for younger generations, they don't really like the authoritative image of generational transmission. But public policy, I'm not sure public policy has an awful lot to do here, unfortunately. But with institutions such as your own, you certainly have a role to play in sharing. It's a form of verticality. It's a kind of top-down experience and expertise which is being passed down, which is already a bit of an ask for younger for consumers. And that's certainly an opportunity to get in touch with young people, to get into the bubbles, if you will. But amongst peers, peer to peer, there's a lot being done already via social media. And I think the answer isn't one or the other. We need both. We need vertical and horizontal transmission. Yeah, I think it's worth emphasizing the potential, the power of horizontal transmission among pairs. That power has been amplified by social media, but the mimetic impact among young generations is very important. When I showed you the little bubbles, the cultural bubbles, you have to bear in mind that it's within those different cultural bubbles that these people are learning and engaging with these different projects. So those cultural bubbles, vectors for learning and for transmission of the wine culture. So I think the ideal future for the narrative of wine could be vertical. Why not that vertical generational transmission? But also horizontally, multiple bubbles. There was the last question, I believe. No? Okay. In that case, thank you very much. Really, thank you very much for that presentation.